Iain Duncan Smith labelled Brexit a new Reformation for the UK, arguing there will be an explosion of talent and opportunity. The former Tory leader also believes the UK will leave the EU under no-deal terms. Mr. Duncan Smith told Bloomberg, "The problem is when you have been attached to an organisation as centrally controlling as the EU, then it's very difficult. People get persuaded that there is no life outside. But when you think that the UK after 40 years still does the majority of its trade outside the EU, not in the EU, which is unique to the UK, our growth markets are outside the EU, we actually have a surplus with trade in places like the United States and all these other countries around the world. We run a deficit, an enormous deficit in trade with the EU. So I think outside we will do incredibly well. It is like another Reformation. It will be the same explosion of talent and opportunity. It's a new Reformation," the former Work and Pensions Secretary added. The choice is very simply that unless this deal gets a change to the backstop legal binding, then it is simply unacceptable to Parliament. That means essentially, I believe, ultimately, we will be leaving very much without a withdrawal agreement. I think that is where we are heading. Answering a question on whether the threat of extending Article 50 would change his position on Theresa May's Brexit deal, Mr. Duncan Smith said, "I don't think it changes anything really, because I ask the question, why would the EU want an extension for 2 months, because that is not going to change anything." Brexit News. Iain Duncan Smith said, "Brexit is like image Getty, Bloomberg. It will be the same explosion of talent and opportunity." And Duncan Smith, "If we did have 2 months one way or the other, doesn't change anything either way. The reality is they are just about to go to European elections. They have reallocated all the seats that the UK used to hold. If we went longer, that it would be absolute chaos in Europe. Then if we left a year and a half later, they would still have to remain as MEPs even if we had left, because there is no legal precedent for them to stay out. So the European Union knows desperately it does not want us to stay longer than the extra 2 months, and I think that they are going to say, look, if we have got a deal and you need a few extra weeks to get the legislation through, then that's fine, but just staying an extra 2 months for no particular purpose is all by those who want to remain and never accepted it. They hope there would be a chance to have a longer extension of a year or two, and then they will have another referendum. That is the reality. So the answer is, I don't believe we are going to be extending. I think ultimately we will leave, and if necessarily we will leave without an agreement." The comments follow Amber Rudd admitting the government may need the support from rival parties in order to win next week's meaningful vote on Mrs. May's Brexit deal. But during a question-and-answer session following a speech to the disability charity Scope, the Work and Pensions Secretary refused to be drawn on what would happen if the government loses the Brexit vote. She said, "I hope and believe that the deal will get through, with help from all parties potentially. We will have to see what happens the day after, but I am planning for a successful future, making sure that we do get the deal that we want. MPs, businesses, the whole country, mostly hope we can get a deal."